I do think they are running out of these missiles, and we see that by nature of the fact that they are now purchasing ballistic missiles from Iran.
Do you think that we're maybe not seeing with clear eyes what is happening on the Russian side?
So I think that just as the Russians underestimated Ukrainian will at the start of the war and continue to underestimate Ukrainian will and overestimate their capacity to break it, Western analysis and often Ukrainian analysis underestimates Russian will.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. This week, a former U.S. Army intelligence analyst on the war in Ukraine, and the international crisis group's Olga Oliker. Is there any chance of peace talks? Any at all? One interesting note before we get to the interviews. Russia's President Putin said last week he never threatened anyone with nuclear weapons. Well, here's what he did say. I want to remind you that our country also has various means of destruction, and for separate components and more modern than those of NATO countries. And when the territorial integrity of our country is threatened to protect Russia and our people, we will certainly use all the means at our disposal. I'm not bluffing, said Putin. Sounds nuclear to me. And this week on his Telegram channel, Dmitry Medvedev, who was a stand-in for President Putin and is a current member of Russia's Security Council. If it is not Russia that wins, then apparently Ukraine. The goal of Ukraine in the war was named by the Kiev regime, the return of all territories that previously belonged to it. That is, their rejection from Russia. This is a threat to the existence of our state and the collapse of present-day Russia. Therefore, a direct reason for using paragraph 19 of the Fundamentals of State Policy of the Russian Federation in the field of nuclear deterrence. Now, if it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, that's a nuclear duck. All right, Joseph Shelzi is a research associate with the Soufan Center think tank. He served as an intelligence officer in the U.S. Army. Joseph, thanks so much for talking to us.
Yeah, happy to be with you, Dana. As you mentioned, I'm with the Soufan Center. I have to say up front that all my views are my own, not necessarily those of the Soufan Center, but really pleased to be with you.
And for people that don't know the Soufan Center, it is just full of really some terrific people on terrorism issues, on anything geopolitical. I have huge respect for the Soufan Center. So, look, a lot has been happening in Ukraine in the last 24, 48, 72 hours, and even less than that today. But Russia has been hammering Ukraine with dozens of missiles, many of them intercepted. Right now, we're hearing that at least 50 cruise missiles were fired. Is this, in your view, is this punishment, or does it have a tactical purpose?
I don't necessarily think that they're different from one another in the Russians' eyes. I think that the Russians through this war have been frustrated. They've shown a complete inability to execute combined arms maneuver, and this has resulted in some very embarrassing battlefield setbacks and collapses. And this is them reaching to an old tactic, which they proved in Syria, and it's entirely designed to, as you mentioned, punish the Ukrainian population. But that serves a dual purpose because not only does it psychologically terrorize the population, but it also, in their hopes, erodes popular support for the war effort and potentially pushes President Zelensky to the negotiating table. I don't think that's going to happen, but I believe that is the intent behind these kinds of attacks.
Analysts keep telling us that Russia's running out of missiles, and that some of the bans on imports would prevent Russia from restocking its supply, and that it could take years for it to catch up, not a matter of months. But I mean, every time they say that, you see these incredible numbers of attacks, which took place after the Crimea bridge was attacked, and it was a daily volley of missiles from Russia and drones, just not all missiles, but drones as well. And today, 50 missiles fired. It sure doesn't seem like they're running out of anything.
Well, I do think they are running out of these missiles, and we see that by nature of the fact that they are now purchasing ballistic missiles from Iran. Recently they completed arms sales with Iran. They purchased two separate systems of drones, two separate types of ballistic missiles, and those are what we're seeing in these attacks. There may be some Russian cruise missiles interspersed within those attacks, but by and large, they're now relying on imported Iranian weapons, and their industrial military complex is unable to keep up with the pace of the fighting in Ukraine.
So what would you say about the timing of this? I mean, it comes right after the attack, these waterborne drone attacks, which took place in Sevastopol harbor over the weekend. It's probably, the Russians never want to talk about damage to warships, but I mean, they never told us that the Moskva sank until many weeks later. Now you have reports from the Ukrainian side that probably it damaged a Russian frigate, maybe a minesweeper. In terms of military strategy and tactics, some people are saying that this is history making, the use of these waterborne drones by the Ukrainians.
It certainly is. I think that the unmanned systems are not new. They've been around for a long time. However, we're getting better at using them, and the Ukrainians are really leading in this effort. They've been very ingenious in their implementation of these kinds of systems, and we've seen that with unmanned aerial systems as well as these uncrewed surface vessels, as you mentioned, and they're having an impact. It may not. It's too early to tell what the battle damage assessment was from these attacks. Psychological impact as well, not only on the Russian Black Sea fleet, but also for the Ukrainian population. And when the Ukrainian military is able to use these very cost-effective systems to enable deep strikes within the Russian support zone, it boosts the morale of the Ukrainian people. And I can imagine they may need it right now after the series of attacks that have targeted Ukrainian cities, producing blackouts, and now I'm hearing water shortages. So I imagine it's quite effective. Maybe not from a direct military perspective, but absolutely from a morale and psychological perspective.
Yeah, and it's important to keep in mind while there's damage to a couple of warships. In fact, the Ukrainian cities are being hammered for 8 months now, and you make that point, and I appreciate that. The former Lieutenant Army commander in Europe, retired Ben Hodges, he responded on Twitter, and I know Ben quite well, but he said, when the Russian Ministry of Defense came out and said massive attacks using these waterborne drones. He said massive. It's like wait till you see the HIMARS get in range of Crimea, then you'll see massive. Do you think that that's coming, and how the Russians will be able to react to that? That will be a much more serious chapter in this conflict if Ukraine is able to bring direct fire onto the Crimea, the illegally annexed peninsula that was taken by the Russians in 2014.
I do think it's coming. I think as the Ukrainian advance around Kherson progresses, those systems will come within range of Crimea. Obviously, it is a statement move to attack the Russian occupied Crimea with artillery systems like the HIMARS. But so far, President Zelensky and his staff have shown a willingness to bring the war to Crimea. We've seen the attack on the Kerch Bridge Strait. We've seen the attack on the Saki Air Base earlier in the summer. And I see no reason why he would stop at launching those kinds of attacks. Although they've been cagey about admitting responsibility for them, it would be militarily very effective to jeopardize the supply and logistics bases that the Russians have in Crimea. And it would really be destabilizing for their defense of southern Ukraine.
What kind of a fight do you think is waiting for the Ukrainians right now as they close in around Kherson? I mean, you were in Iraq, and you know U.S. forces who were very good, certainly had their challenges in these urban environments. When you have to go, and I followed them as a reporter, going, door to door, house by house, room by room. It's incredibly exhausting, time consuming. I mean, and it sounds like the Russians are ready for an urban warfare fight in Kherson.
Yeah, it is. It's an interesting question. So I think if you ask the Russian generals, they want nothing to do with that. The problem is that Putin's political aims do not align with the Russian generals' preference to withdraw from Kherson to the eastern side of the river. So I do believe that there's a possibility that this could devolve into some very, very brutal, house to house fighting in Kherson. One alternative to that is if the Ukrainians are able to move their artillery systems to within range of the supply lines that are feeding Russian defenders in Kherson. If they're able to successfully interdict those supply lines, I think even to President Putin, it will be clear that the defense of Kherson is untenable, and he may authorize a withdrawal. But it's hard to predict right now.
Joseph, will you talk to the export grain deal that Russia has now backed out of? So the ships that are leaving Odessa carrying grain for hungry countries were at first cut off, and now Turkey, working with the UN, is escorting some of those ships as we speak. And it seems like this operation is fraught with potential crisis. And now the Kremlin says, quote unquote, it's risky for Ukraine to export grain through the Black Sea. Russian spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters this morning that the deal is now hardly feasible and takes on a very different character, much more risky, dangerous, and unguaranteed. I mean, that sounds like a proverbial shot over the bow right away.
Yeah, certainly menacing rhetoric. The Russians withdrew from this deal in response to the, as they described it, massive attack on the Black Sea fleet. And right now, the grain shipments are going ahead. However, the Russians could decide to step in at any time to intercept them and prevent them from arriving at their destination. So I don't think they're going to do that.
And they may not do so openly. They may do so from the shadows or with a mine or with a submarine. There's a lot of different ways that they can cause havoc with those ships that, by the way, rely on private insurance companies to insure them, unless the UN's guaranteeing the value of those shipping companies.
Right. You're absolutely right. They could do that. I think there's also a possibility that they will cite some sort of trumped up provocation, inventing a story that the Ukrainians are using these ships to smuggle nefarious goods out of the country or into the country. And that would be used as justification for intercepting the ships. But I think that, that's a possibility. I think it's the next step in an escalatory ladder that the Russians have proven very willing to climb. And the tragedy is that this is problematic for, of course, the Ukrainian grain markets, absolutely. But also a lot of people in the Middle East and Africa who depend on Ukrainian grain imports. And even with the specter of this possibility out there, I think we're gonna see rises in food prices and an increase in food security as a result of this Russian withdrawal.
It would have been probably more risky if NATO had said that they would escort those ships. It's not NATO. This is a UN operation backed by Turkey. And President Erdogan has been pretty adept at walking this tightrope between his responsibility as a member of NATO, pleasing his Western allies, not all the time, and at the same time, he's kept an open dialogue with President Putin and Russia. It becomes tricky for the Russians to mess around with these convoys that are Turkish ship led and being guarded to some extent.
That's right. Yeah, that's absolutely right. They would have to be very, very careful in how they went about intercepting them, because the repercussions could be enormous if they were to go about it in the wrong way. So it's definitely something that they will be careful in approaching if they do deem to intercept this traffic.
All right, you're a former intelligence guy, and I know you guys like to look at and analyze and reflect. Tell me, just the last question to you: how do you think that this is going to go? I mean, because there's a lot of positive spin on Ukraine's advancement on the battlefield, because by them trumpeting that as loud as they can, that keeps the West from being divided. It stops some of the voices that are calling for them to go back to the negotiating table now and come up with some kind of ceasefire and some kind of negotiated resolution. If they can show progress, then people are willing to wait to some degree. It also justifies all of the arms that are coming from the West and the billions of dollars in expenditures. I mean, what is your assessment? Are we putting too positive a spin on how the Ukrainians are doing, or how do you think this is going to play out in the next few months?
I think there's no denying that we are looking at this through a Western lens. We're only seeing part of the picture, but I think that's important to acknowledge. But I also think it's it's something that we had to understand. But going into the winter, I think that Ukraine and the Ukrainian government is going to continue trying to boost its population's morale, and it's going to prove its will to fight, to reassure its Western supporters as well, and keep those arms shipments coming by launching attacks like the one we saw in the Black Sea Fleet, for instance. This, coupled with steady gains in offensives around Kherson, are going to be very important as we go into what could be a very long winter. And we can already see signs that Ukrainian civilians are going to be tested. So these kinds of reassuring, battlefield successes are going to be very important to civilian morale. It's also important to remember that this is Putin's point of maximum leverage over Europe in terms of energy. After this winter, energy diversification will be fully underway, and Russia will no longer have the hold it currently does over European energy markets. I think going forward, Russia will continue to target civilian infrastructure while trying to stabilize their front lines with the newly arrived conscripts that they've filled their ranks out with through mobilization. But without the proper equipment, not only for just general offensive warfare, but also for winter warfare, it's really unlikely that the Russians are going to go back on the offensive anytime soon. Ukraine, however, will likely continue to press its advantage. The winter conditions will absolutely slow things down, but the fighting will continue, and it's in Ukraine's interest to press its advantage as long as it can. Battlefield victories can go a long way to motivating a civilian population living without essential services and enduring regular air raids.
Joseph Shelzi with the Soufan Centres. Joseph, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Olga Oliker is with the International Crisis Group. Olga, welcome. How are you today?
I'm all right. Thanks for having me back.
Is there any movement towards getting the fighting stopped between Ukraine and Russia?
Not really. I think from the Ukrainian perspective, they have been successful on the battlefield, and They see very little reason to stop fighting until and unless the Russians recognize that Ukraine is going to win and therefore surrender. From the Russian perspective, I think there's a belief that they can still break the Ukrainian will and or the will of its Western backers through attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure and through expectations of a cold winter hurting Europe, and therefore they see no reason to back down as well.
Breaking the will of Western backers. How do you read some of the rhetoric in the United States? I mean, first of all, a group of Democrats came forward saying, we can't continue to fund billions of dollars, that President Biden should try to urge Ukraine back to the negotiating table. And then later on, they withdrew that. I think they stepped back from that. But
well, it turned out it had been written in the summer when it looked like there was a stalemate and there were a lot of questions about whether or not Ukraine could mount a counteroffensive. So this seems like one of those examples of bureaucracies moving out of line with policies, rather than a real effort by members of the Democratic Party to change the president's policy.
Still, it's a sign, I think, and you can disagree, that this is not a never-ending blank check, especially from the U.S. side. And as the midterms happen and you have Republicans taking over the House potentially, there's going to be a lot of debate about how long, the billions of dollars in military equipment keeps getting funneled to Ukraine. Would you agree with that? And Ukraine is under some time pressure in terms of what it's able to do on the ground.
I think there's certainly going to be debate. I think the administration's answer to that debate is going to be that we're not actually doing this as a favor to Ukraine, right? Much as many of America's members of Congress personally care about Ukraine, the real argument here is that if Russia is successful in this war, and if it's successful in this war in part by using nuclear coercion and nuclear threats, then nobody is safe, and certainly nobody in Europe is safe, and that's not something the United States can let stand, and that's why it's supporting Ukraine. So that argument has generally held sway pretty effectively. I would argue that the Russians help it out with the way that they're conducting the war. So I think there will be debate, but one should not mistake debate for the policy falling apart, right? Debate is the mark of a democracy. It does not mean that a country is on the verge of changing its approach.
I don't know if you watched President Putin at the Valdai Institute last week. You probably read his comments regardless. One of the things he talked about was saying that he had never threatened nuclear force. Do you think that's accurate?
He has hinted and suggested and talked around the issue. He has not directly said, "I will use a nuclear weapon," in Ukraine. He has instead made reference to the U.S. use of nuclear weapons. He has talked about consequences such as you cannot imagine. He has accused Western states of threatening nuclear use, which they have not done. His defense minister has been calling around to his counterparts around the world, saying that Ukraine might use a dirty bomb, which is so unlikely as to be laughable. So no, he hasn't threatened nuclear use, but he has taken pains to remind the world that Russia is a nuclear power, and to allow some questions as to the conditions under which it might use them. And also in the Valdai conference discussion, there was a point where his interlocutor, Father Lukyanov, asked him, about this directly, and Putin paused, right?
I think 10 seconds.
And then Lukyanov said, "You're making us nervous." And Putin said, "Well, that's the point, right?" So that's the point.
Is there, some people have called this mirror imaging, this thing that President Putin does. He accuses other people of threatening nuclear weapons when he did it. They talk about Ukraine preparing a dirty bomb when maybe they're doing that at Zaporizhia, a nuclear power plant, according to the Ukrainians and others. he always twists and turns everything back like a mirror to confuse and obfuscate, and it's a very good tactic at creating chaos by people trying to understand what exactly the Kremlin is trying to say.
They're aiming for a certain amount of ambiguity. And I actually think the dirty bomb discussion is to place in the press, to place in the debate, some questions about what Ukraine is doing, Ukraine's culpability, the idea that not everything is Russia's fault, just to raise some questions. I think that's at least part of the logic behind those statements and comments. But again, it's meant, as Putin himself said, the intention is to unnerve. The intention is to raise doubts. I think the logic is that Moscow wants adversaries like Ukraine and prospective adversaries to think that its bar for escalation might be lower than it actually is. Or at least to wonder if that's the case, and thus ideally be deterred, right? I think everyone is pretty confident that there's a real risk of Russian nuclear use and attendant escalation if there is a direct war between Russia and NATO member states. So everyone, the Russians and the NATO member states, have been avoiding that. What Russia would like the world to think is that other things well below that threshold could also carry those risks. Now, so far, they haven't. Those threats haven't been credible because Russia isn't willing to take those risks. But this is the game, right? It's a psychological game.
They may not have taken those risks so far, but there's the one emotional tripwire certainly seems to be Crimea, whether it be this surface drone attack that took place over the weekend, or whether it was the attack on the Crimean bridge a couple of weeks ago. And that, President Putin may be willing to accept a lot of things in eastern Ukraine where he's, claimed annexations, but the Crimea seems to be a red line for him. Would you agree? And some people have said it is a matter of time before the Crimea itself comes under attack by probably some of these big HIMARS systems that the Ukrainians have.
So that's interesting. I've been reading it the opposite way. When they claim to have annexed indeterminate parts of Ukraine, there was some question about, okay, well, does that mean that they're going to view attacks on these territories as attacks on Russia? To which the response is, well, they haven't viewed attacks on Crimea, or actually, for that matter, attacks on Russia itself, as existential. So yes, they can say they will respond as they have responded to attacks on Crimea, as they have responded to the continuing war in the east and in the south, as they have responded in some cases to attacks in Russia. Is Crimea different from Belgorod, which is in legal Russian borders? I don't see why it would be. The Ukrainians have taken pains not to use HIMARS, American-provided HIMARS, in Ukraine in Crimea against Crimea, or against Russian territory, as far as I can see.
I think that was the deal, and spoken openly about by the Americans, that you cannot use HIMARS and that's why they haven't given them the longer range ATACMS, which hook onto the HIMARS to attack Russia itself, because that would be
but Crimea is not.
Crimea is a big question.
Crimea is not Russia itself.
Really?
I don't
what
know.
Is it?
Crimea is Ukraine.
Since 2014, it's a legal part of Russia, according to the Russians, anyway.
Well, according to the Russians, some, but not all, unclear how much of Donetsk is also a part of Russia, but nobody can tell you where the borders of that are. I mean, Russia could claim that Alaska is a part of Russia. Would that make Alaska a part of Russia? No, it would not. So, occupation does not make something a part of a country, and saying that something is a part of that country, even if you don't occupy it, definitely doesn't. According to all international law, Crimea is a part of Ukraine.
I know that you're focused on eventually seeing the crisis end. I mean, that's what the International Crisis Group does, right? You want to see wars and conflict end. Do you think that President Putin has gone out of his way not to say where these borders of this new annexed area, which you just referred to, the fact that he hasn't absolutely drawn that on a map, that's important for the future discussions on how this will, hopefully eventually end somehow?
No, because to say that that's important for how it ends would be to assume that Russia would hold on to parts of Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk, even if you don't know what those parts are. So I think it's a very dangerous deal in which Russia succeeds in this war by gaining control of Ukrainian territory. In the end, it is up to Russia and Ukraine to make whatever deal they make. If you're just speculating wildly, right, you could consider a deal where Russia gets a little bit bigger, but is forced to demilitarize, right? But nobody is having that conversation right now. That is a conversation that happens when the war is over. And there's really no appetite at all in Ukraine to give up any territory that is legally Ukrainian. And on the one hand, negotiating positions are negotiating positions and they change. On the other hand, if you look at the public opinion polling in Ukraine, I find it really hard to see a Ukrainian government survive giving up territory when something like 99% of the population opposes doing so.
Even as we're seeing just today, 50 cruise missile strikes on Ukraine, on civilian areas, targeting things like power and water, and 80% of Kiev, as we're doing this interview, doesn't have water right now. They may get it switched back on, but surely that's demoralizing to the public.
It is not demoralizing in the sense that it's making people think, wow, we should give up some territory to make the Russians stop. If anything, it's the opposite. So it's unpleasant, but it makes the Ukrainians angrier, not more willing to cut deals.
The media often may be guilty, and for not evil intent, I think, but often trumpeting Ukrainian advancement and this notion that this does not end until the Ukrainians retake all the territory, and that they will win and they will be victorious. Do you think that we're maybe not seeing with clear eyes what is happening on the Russian side?
So I think that just as the Russians underestimated Ukrainian will at the start of the war and continue to underestimate Ukrainian will and overestimate their capacity to break it, Western analysis, and often Ukrainian analysis, underestimates Russian will.
Olga Oliker with the International Crisis Group. Olga, always great to talk to you, and I really do appreciate your thoughts. Thank you so much.
Always a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And that's our backstory for this week. After our interview with the Soufan Centres Joseph Shelzi, in a major U-turn, a statement from Russia's defense ministry announced that it had received written guarantees from Kiev not to use the Black Sea grain corridor for military operations against Russia, and that Russia was rejoining the grain deal. Quote, "The Russian Federation considers that the guarantees received at the moment appear sufficient and resumes the implementation of the agreement," unquote. So Russia will stop using food as a weapon for now, but Ukraine is unlikely to refrain from attacking Russian warships in the future. How long until Russia threatens the food corridor once again? As always, thanks for listening. I'm Dana Lewis, and I'll talk to you again soon.